Evening. Welcome to the 1989 Wallace Stegner Lecture at Lewis Clark State College. Please feel free to come on in and get started. I've probably got 2 minutes worth of material here. 2 minutes worth of material here. Is that okay? You? All right. One reason we're late getting started tonight is Bob Wrigley took our guest of honor to dinner at the Golden Arches, and they were a little slow. We wanted to show him Lewiston's finest. No, actually, I think they went to 3 Mile Inn or something like that. Before I introduce Pete Dexter, I want to acknowledge some people who've made his visit possible here tonight. And first of all, I want to begin by thanking my assistants who wrote this for me, Linda Vacura and Judy Lamphere. And I also want to thank the Institutional Development Fund, the students of Lewis Clark State College, and Vice President William Daling's office for financial support. Most importantly, however, I want to call attention to Dean Hugh Nichols. As many of you know, Hugh is not only the founder of the series, which is now in its 7th year, but this year we went to him with our palms out and he slapped them. And I really appreciate Hugh picking up the lion's share of expenses. One other announcement, on the 26th of April, which is a Wednesday, Mary Blue, a faculty member, will be reading right here in this room, and I hope you'll all come to that. As many of you know, Pete Dexter comes to us tonight from Sacramento, where he lives with his wife and daughter. So far, Pete's published 3 volumes of fiction: God's Pocket, Deadwood, and Paris Trout. Paris Trout, of course, won the 1988 National Book Award for Fiction last December. Long before those awards were announced, however, William Styron, the author of Sophie's Choice, had this to say about Pete's most recent book. Quote, "A grim and fascinating novel filled with wonderfully comic touches by a writer whose brilliant understanding of the Deep South has allowed him to capture much of its essence, its bitter class distinctions, its violence, its strangeness, with a fidelity of detail and an ear for speech that I have rarely encountered since Flannery O'Connor." Actually, I much prefer what Roy Blount had to say. It comes much closer to my feeling about the novel. I put it down, Roy says, to wipe off the sweat. As you can see, all 3 of Pete's novels are on sale in the lobby, and Pete has assured me that he'd be willing to sign some books after his lecture. As good as his fiction is, I want to risk saying that his nonfiction is every bit as good. That's how I knew Pete Dexter as a writer, is I started reading his nonfiction when he was regularly contributing to Playboy. So that's why I hadn't thought about that before I wrote it down, but that's where I read him. I read it. That's good. I read Playboy. Actually, I saw other pieces in Esquire and in Sports Illustrated, and as far as I know, he's still publishing there. Probably one of the things I admire most about Pete is that he's a working writer, and by that I mean that he's a professional. He's somebody who actually makes his living by writing. 3 times a week, for example, he turns out an award-winning column for the Sacramento Bee. Before moving to Sacramento 3 years ago, he worked 12 years for the Philadelphia Daily News. In Philadelphia, he trained at the Rosati Gym, where I'm told he used to spar with a young light heavyweight named Randall Tex Cobb. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce to you tonight's only contender, wearing a blue blazer, tan pants, an open tie, standing 5 feet inches tall and weighing in at 160 pounds, that skinny kid who used to infuriate University of South Dakota football players by beating them at arm wrestling, Pete Dexter.
Thank you. guess maybe we ought to start out by saying I know this is supposed to be a lecture, but I don't lecture. I thought maybe I'll just stand up here and complain till I run out of things to quit talking about, and then they said it was supposed to go about an hour, and I would appreciate it if you could think of some questions to ask as we go along. Thought maybe I'd just start with a story. 3 months ago, as you can see, well, maybe you can't see, it was 3 months ago, I had some work done on one of my legs. In the week that followed that surgery, I lay in bed with tubes running everywhere in and out of my body, and all the mechanisms on the ceiling and the bags hanging from the bag racks. And my legs were strapped to a machine that was squeezing them at 10-second intervals. That's how you kind of pass the time. And I was, as you might expect, a recipient of a considerable amount of medication designed to eliminate pain, which didn't quite make up for the tubes, but was a step in the right direction. At any rate, one particular night, under the influence of this painkiller, I had a strange dream. In it, I got up, and the tubes were hanging out of me like some kind of uprooted tree, and I went to the bathroom. Now, to make it clear, right now that I'm not here to endorse drug abuse or anything, but just allow me to say a couple nice things about this particular drug. And one of which was that it completely removed, any kind of inhibitions I would have, and second, it not only killed the pain, it gave my dreams a real-life quality and a detail and a texture that I've, rarely experienced even in, real life. And so on one hand, I was dreaming, I was walking into the bathroom. On the other hand, there was nothing dreamlike about it. It was completely without those black spaces, that always haunt the rooms in my dreams. It was missing that irritating sense of repetition. I don't know, maybe you don't dream the same way when things keep going over and over and you can't get it to get beyond a place. So which is all to say that I believed it. I really believed it. And I believed that when I went in the bathroom, there were 2 koi fish in the toilet. For those of you who haven't been in the hospital, a koi fish is in the carp family. It looks a lot like a goldfish, only it's about maybe 2 feet long. And I believed it. I believed it when I saw the bear walk out of the shower. And it came out of the stall, and it reached into the toilet and started messing with my fish. It was splashing them. You've seen the National Geographic specials where the grizzly goes in after the salmon. Well, you folks probably seen it in person, but I never have. So anyway, I believed that, and I believed enough of it that coming out of my sleep, I found the button there next to the bed and called a nurse. And a minute later, her voice came on, and I remember she was real tired, and she was kind of irritated, and said, "May I help you?" I might add here that by this time, I've been in the hospital and on this uninhibiting drug long enough where I'd fired several of the nurses by now. It turns out, you don't have that authority as a patient, but I don't see any reason, that should let you get in the way of saying the words. And particularly this nurse named Helga. I had to let her go half a dozen times. And that means, thinking back on it, that the nursing staff and I were not probably on the best of terms even before I told the person on the other end of the line that there was a bear in my bathroom bothering my fish. And I can remember, there was the longest pause. You could just hear him sigh. Just like I'd walk in the living room with, mud all over my feet or something, or with the dog had jumped on the couch that way. It was that same sigh you get from your wife. So anyway, she said, she was quiet a minute, and then she said, "Pardon me, please." They said please at the end of everything on these things. And I said, "Don't give me that shit, lady. Send somebody in here to kill this bear." And I thought about it, and I said, "Send Helga." And this does have a point. And she said to me, "We'll have someone there in just a minute," which, of course, is one of the 3 big lies of hospitals. Along with, this won't hurt and here's something to eat. So I slipped back into a kind of a quieter, less episodic, I guess you could say, sleep. And this one time when I came out of it, there was a nurse just standing there at the end of my bed, and she was smiling at me, and she looked, I don't know how to put this, she looked pleasant almost. It was nothing like Helga, I can tell you. And for a second I thought it was just another, there was another bear, it was a hallucination. And I said, "You must have the wrong room." And she smiled at me, and she looked at my, poor drug body and tubes coming in and out everywhere and the machine squeezing my legs at 10-second intervals. And as close as I can remember it, she said the following words to me. She said, "It's gotta be so much fun." And we looked at each other a long time while I thought of something to say back to that. And finally to get her to stop smiling. And by now, I was thinking, you read in the papers about these nurses that sneak around the hospital at night administering fatal doses of medicine to the patients they feel sorry for. And the papers always call them, like the angel of death. I thought I had one of those. But she sat down at the, I asked her what, and she sat down on a chair near the bed, and she said, "Being a writer." And then she confessed that she was, first thing she said was she was supposed to be on her ward, and she'd come off on a break up there to talk to me because she'd heard about the bear. And she said she wanted to be a writer all her life, which I suppose by this time was 22 or 23 years. And I gave her some advice. I said she ought to do it instead of, wanting it. After all, writing, it isn't like being a Kennedy. Anybody can go buy a typewriter. And she sat there, 22 or 23 years old, and told me she didn't have the talent. And her proof as it developed was that she'd never seen a bear in her toilet, And she said nobody she knew had ever seen a bear in her toilet, and nobody in the history of the 4th floor Sutter General Hospital in Sacramento had seen anything like that either. And that it took, in her estimation, a special sort of person to see a bear in a hospital, not to mention the koi fish. And that it must be wonderful to have the gift, not to mention being able to walk into a bookstore and see your name on the books. And then she said it to me again, "It's got to be so much fun." And I have to admit, the woman got my attention. At least I've been thinking about what she said off and on, for the last 3 months. And wondering if in some way she was right, if being a writer is any fun. Because fun, after all, is the only ambition that I can ever remember having as a kid that lasted into my adulthood, if this is an adulthood. Long-term daily fun. And strangely enough, my idea of what fun is hasn't really changed that much. The roots are the same. I hear that word and I think of a food fight. And I can tell you this much, writing is a long ways down the line on, the list. At any rate, having finally approached the subject of writing here, I probably ought to make a distinction at the beginning between being a writer, and putting quotes around that, and, being a writer. And those are two different things the way I mean them. The first kind of being a writer, the one in quotes, is the pose, in the public agony of a creative mind. You can put that in quotes too, creative. You sit around bars and restaurants, mostly in New York, but it can happen anywhere, telling people you're a novelist. And you cultivate a certain following among those people who believe it, that you are special or different because you published a book. And that, of course, leads, the idea behind all this is, it leads to gratuitous sex. And sometimes, by the way, the writer himself begins to believe this, that he's special, and that he's as special or as different, is entitled even, after he leaves the typewriter, to his own rules on the outside as he is on the pages, and assuming that the writer in question writes. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you that none of that is fun. On the other hand, when you read an interview with one of these writers, the kind in quotes, who gets by like that. And then you read later, you see him publicly agonizing over being on the same self-destructive track as F. Scott Fitzgerald and Truman Capote. And you have to wonder if the pose doesn't eventually eat the brain. I mean, the particular writer I'm thinking of now has obviously talked about being a writer so hard and so long that he's lost track of the accompanying obligation, which is that you're supposed to put words on a page in a way that indicates, even to an outsider, someone who's never had gratuitous sex with you, that there's some sort of organized pattern of thought. And without that, it doesn't look so brave, fighting to save your talent from, from ending up in the same, lifeboat with Fitzgerald and Capote, because even people who believe everything you say know you can't drown without water, except it says here, I don't remember writing it, possibly in bullshit. And that isn't long-term fun either way, I don't think. It can't be. And so what does that leave? And this is where it gets a little depressing. It leaves you and the typewriter in 1,000 sheets of clean paper. And for 18 months or however long it takes, you get up every morning and, dirty a couple of those papers, pieces of paper up with words. At least that's as much as I can do. There are writers who, get more pieces of paper dirty every morning, and there's some who probably get less dirty, but there's a certain wall, I think, out for just about everybody. And for me, it's 900 words or so. That you run into it, and after it, everything you touch turns stale. At least it seems stale, and you're just wasting your time then. And as unpleasant as it is for me to report this, getting those 900 words in the morning is what being a writer is about. And there's nothing that strikes, an old food tosser like me as fun about it, at least not in the ordinary sense. And part of the reason for that is the whole time I'm writing, I'm fighting with it. I probably have trouble communicating the exact tone of the argument to you, but it's something like if you've ever had a conversation with one of those people you run into once in a while in college. Most of them grow up to be lawyers who keep saying, define your terms. And you define your terms, and they say, well, define what you mean by that. And it's like that for me, sentence after sentence and paragraph after paragraph. And in the end, you come to see where all these arguments are settled, at least I think they're settled, they're resolved in the nouns. That is what language is in the end, I think. It's the names of things. It's where language started. It's the source and the reason for words. I mean, before there were any ideas, there were things, right? I'm not making this point very clearly, I don't think, but when the ideas showed up, one of the first one was, shit, these things need names. And while that was leading to something there, and I just kind of lost it. Couldn't have been important, right? It's, you call my mother right now and ask her and say, well, Pete just forgot something. She'll say it couldn't have been important. I grew up wondering if maybe on December 6th or something, somebody walked into, Roosevelt and said they're going to bomb Pearl Harbor, or forgot to say that. Said they're going to bomb something. I can't remember what. Anyway, while we're talking about language, I might offer a couple of thoughts about the process that translates the words people speak in life into the way they speak on paper. Let's just say the way I translate that. And the first thing is, before I write about a place, I go there and listen to the way people speak. I have the idea, and I can't prove this. I can't prove any of this, including that stuff I told you about the nouns, that in spite of the way language changes to accommodate technology, that more of it stays the same than changes, and that it is individual to a place. So what I'm saying here, and not especially well, is that when I do go to Georgia or the Black Hills, or even back to Philadelphia to listen to people. And I find, you know, somebody whose family has been there 100 years, I can hear 100 years, you know, language. I can hear a voice from 100 years old in them. And when you put that together with what you know historically about the place, even if you're writing a book in the, you know, set in the present, suddenly everything comes technicolor, you know, and you understand things that you didn't know you understood. And they just, I mean, they, I don't know exactly how that process works, but there it is. I mean, it comes to you when you're sitting down at the typewriter. And the question, I guess, though, is how you get that language on paper to make it technicolor for the reader, too. And that's more complicated. And I'm not sure I can explain that very well either, except to say that you don't take it down word for word. That, to me, that's a waste of time. You, if you try to exactly mimic the speech you hear in half a page, people are going to be tired of it. There's no colloquialism, you know, that's going to be as meaningful or as sharp to the reader like the 10th time to read it as it was the first time. So you don't want to keep using the same words to mean the same thing. I mean, you don't want to keep hammering the same peculiar piece of language at people that aren't used to it, because it just gets tiring. So what you do, I guess, is you suggest real dialogue. You drop pieces of it in little pieces, I think, that give you the sound of the sound, but you don't get the sound itself. And people come away from that thinking they've heard, you know, the Black Hills in the 1870s, or they've heard, you know, Georgia in the 1950s, or they've heard Philadelphia. And in a way they have, but in a true way they haven't, because if you say the words out loud in those places, they won't resemble the real patterns of speech. So I try to put all that together with what I know about nouns, of course. And while I'm having at the same time this book-long argument with myself over, you know, defining what names are and what they mean. And in some way, from that argument, something begins to happen on a page that seems realer than what I sit down with. I mean, it's better than what happens on the page is better than what happens in my head, which is not that much of an accomplishment. In the process of making it work, however, there are some unexpected troubles. It turns out that it's not only a difficult name to put on the right thing, put the right name on the thing. It can also be painful. In naming it, you recognize it, and you already know where it came from, right? And so on a fairly regular basis, you're pulling something out of your own head that, I don't know if many of you saw the movie Alien, but it looks like that thing that ate its way out of that guy's chest in Alien. And you see those things, and you want to go back where it's safe, you know, where you can be, you know, think of yourself as pretty again. But you can't go back. I think another writer said that someplace along the line. It changes you. And so all you can really do is make your deal, which in my case is the 900 words for the day. And then you spend the rest of the day ignoring the connection between, you know, what you write and what you are. And that is a different thing, by the way, because if it weren't, I think it's fair to say, like, the best writers would be the best people. And I can, you know, take you any number of places in New York and prove to you that's not true in 5 minutes. I mean, so anyway, the way I write, the way I work is the 900 words, and then I write them one day, and then I go over them the next day, you know, pulling the weeds, and then I do the next 900 words. And the worst thing about the process that I just described is that many of the weeds you pull are better looking than the flowers. And that's to say that truly a third of your very best stuff, the stuff that seems to come from someplace that you don't, it isn't there, it isn't planned, it comes at you from, almost from the page. It's like you discover it instead of write it. A third of that stuff, when you look at the next day, doesn't belong there. It's still good. It may be better, well, I mean, we're all speaking relatively here, but I mean, it's still good for me, or what passes for good, it just doesn't belong in the book. And it's an act of, I mean, it takes an act of willpower to pull that thing out. And willpower may be a lot of things, but it's not anybody's idea of fun that I know of. On the other hand, I'd be lying to you if I said there wasn't a certain satisfaction to finishing the 900 words for the day. It isn't overwhelming. Even when I'm writing well, it's certainly nothing that holds up, I'm reminded here of a time there was this kid named Jimmy Mims that I went to school with back in Georgia, and we had a teacher in 4th grade named Miss Calhoun with a hairdo that and I threw a full little pints of, an open and full carton of milk at Jimmy Mims and missed him and hit Miss Calhoun right in the back of the head. And there's nothing in writing that, even approaches that for satisfaction. I sat there at the National Book Awards, and as nice as that was, it's not, I know in my heart it's not going to last as long. There's no chance. That's the trouble with writers. We all want to sit around and talk about, things we used to be able to do. All right, so you spend a year at the typewriter, and during this period of time, by the way, and I don't think this is true for many people, but nothing for myself, speaking for myself, nothing that anybody else writes makes any sense during this period of time that I'm actually working myself. There's something in the mixture going from your timing to somebody else's timing that resembles putting grapefruit and milk in your mouth at the same time. I can't even try it anymore. It just doesn't work. So you spend a year without books, and at the end of this year, I shouldn't say without books. I can read stuff like I can go back and read Ross McDonald. I can read mysteries. I can read stuff that's it's entertaining if you don't have to. Or I shouldn't say Ross McDonald because you should think about him. But I read him enough where I don't anymore. But I can read things like that. But I can't pick up somebody that's trying to be serious and give it any attention at all. So anyway, you spend a year without the books, and a stack of paper at the end of the year, for reasons I do not understand, it reaches the top of the typewriter. And that is fun, in a way. It's the same way that it's fun when you reach Sioux City and you realize you've driven through Iowa. And well, it is. It's like looking at the miles. Daddy, how far we got to go? And 6 months after the paper reaches the height of the typewriter, for reasons I do not understand, the book is finished, almost to the day. And I think any reasonable person would assume that at the conclusion of a book, there would be a moment of overwhelming fun and happiness and fulfillment and satisfaction and gratification, all that stuff. And that once again, for other writers, that might be true. If I could just stop for 1 second here, I have a little note. I have a quick story about that satisfaction, and it goes back to the night of the National Book Awards when a reporter from one of the New York tabloids stopped me on the way out of the Pierre Hotel, which I can tell you is one hell of a lot nicer than Sutter General Hospital in Sacramento, and asked why I hadn't cried when I got this award. Now, the reason she asked that is because my friend Neil Sheehan, who had won for nonfiction with a book called A Bright Shining Lie, which was a work that took 16 years of his time and all of his assets, to produce. And when he'd gone up there, there'd been a little break in his voice. And so this woman from the New York paper noticed it and wanted to know if the award meant less to me than to him. And I can tell you what I said, shit, lady, if I'd spent 16 years writing a book, I'd be crying right now just to have finished. So, at any rate, what I'm saying here is I mean, for me, there is no moment of quiet satisfaction. You know, it's done. The minute the book is finished and I see it's finished, I begin to miss it. It's not like losing a foot, as a writer with 2 feet once told me in a bar. But there is a sense of loss, both of the story and of kind of a purpose. And my note here says it's a little note here. It says Lone Ranger. I know what this is. Yeah, it's like what the Lone Ranger used to always say to his horse. You know, hi ho, Silver, away. And I know exactly how Silver felt. You know, away to what? You know. Everybody else seems to know where they're going, and you got some certifiable guy with a, you know, wearing a mask when he shaves in the morning, you know, to carry around until you get there. And that's some load. Luckily, at the time of your loss of purpose and direction and all that, there is something to replace it. You mail your manuscript to your editor. Actually, I usually bring mine in person. I drop it like about 2 feet off his desk so he'll understand what he's put me through. And a week or two after that, you invariably get a phone call with this editor telling you, my guy likes to tell me that I've written Moby Dick, but then he always says, you know, he doesn't, there's a couple of things, you know, just 1 or 2 things here, Pete, that I don't quite understand. And you say, you know, like what, Bob? And he says, well, then he'll read you the first sentence. He says, for instance. Now, this phone call, I got to admit, it still surprises me. I'm sure it'll keep happening. And after 3 books, it still strikes me as unfair. I mean, I can't put it any other way. I mean, after all, I put in a lot of years sitting in classrooms, and I never understood any of this shit. And in fact, I assume you weren't supposed to understand it because, you know, these people need teaching or they'd have to go to work, right? I mean, if anybody but them understood it. Now, all of a sudden, I'm on the other side of the fence and they're changing the rules. And nobody's talking about the mysteries of irony or, you know, or the shadings and the light and dark motifs. I mean, nobody's picking up on that stuff. I mean, I assume it's in my book, too. I mean, why wouldn't it be? So they changed the rules for me, and then you pick up a book. If I could just dump on satanic verses for 1 minute, I'd just like to stop for a second and ask, has anybody in this room read that book? And has anybody in the room, I mean, I know there's people in this room that have bought the book. I've talked to, you know, I keep in touch with, you know, people in New York at different publishing houses, and you know, the book sold out everywhere, and I don't know anybody except the woman that bought it for Viking who's read more than 19 pages of it. That seems to be the, as far as anybody can go. So I suggest that, you know, if you get a chance, you ought to pick it up and try to get past 19. Anyway, nobody's asking Salman Rushdie what he meant, or, you know, straighten out ambiguous stuff, or if they did, he wasn't answering. Anyway, back to the telephone. You speak to your editor, you return your manuscript, you know, he'll send it back to you, and you mess with it for a week or a week and a half until it seems like something that will make sense to anybody. And then you take it back in and drop it on his desk again. And the process is going to make you bitter, at least it's made me bitter, but it's followed by a certain period of downtime, as they say in the computer industry. The nuclear industry, too, now I think about it. And during this time, you don't really speak to anybody at the publishing house at all. And so you sit there, you know, maybe you drive into the mountains or you read books that you've, you know, been meaning to read. And you understand the book. And all in all, it isn't a bad time, except you wonder the whole time what they're thinking. I mean, the guy said it's Moby Dick, but he, you know, didn't understand a little bit of it, and, you know, you don't believe it. And the next news that comes is delivered by Federal Express, and it is a copy of your manuscript. And it's the most insulting thing. It's covered with editing marks, changing your punctuation, questioning your choice of words. Asking you in a, kind of roundabout way if you've had any kind of formal education at all. That's what it is. And these marks, I might add, they're administered to your manuscript by a proofreader, which is not an editor. And what that means is, except for knowing a bunch of rules of grammar that you never heard of, this person probably isn't even any smarter than you are. So they're letting the hired help kind of, insult you. And which is just, it's another kind of affront. So a cover letter accompanies, the corrected manuscript. And it'll be 2 or 3 pages long, and what it will be, it isn't personal, it just explains what each of the little marks that they make on this manuscript mean, and what corresponding mark you're supposed to make to either indicate you agree with the change, or you disagree with the change, or you want to make a change your own. And so you go through the whole book and put it back the way it was before they gave it to the proofreader. And then you drop it a third time on your editor's desk along with I've always written the proofreader a letter back. And for a while then things are quiet again. And it's during this quiet period, as I remember, that you receive the check. Now, with a check, I think, a check has some potential, right? The way business is usually done, not always, but usually either you're paid your advance, which is money they give you against potential royalties, in either 2 or 3 payments, depending on how your agent works the deal out. With the last one comes due, and it's usually the largest one at the end of, when the book is completed. And it seems to me that if that check were large enough, opening the day, the mail on that day that it comes in would in fact be fun. It would. It speaks to that, that basic aspect of fun, which is getting away with something in public, and the grown-ups can't get you alone later, and scold you for it. They can't do anything about it. And I think that end of it will be fulfilled in that event. All this, I remind you again, is just my speculation. I'm not sure what number would have to appear on the check for it to be, to cause fun. But none of the numbers I've seen yet are even close. I can tell you that the numbers I see, I feel like I've earned them. And while I'm much of a believer in hard work and the dignity of, labor as the next guy, that has nothing to do with what we're talking about today. And so the rule is, if you have to figure out something is fun, it wasn't fun, right? So anyway, you cast a check and wait and see what comes in the mail next. And now it gets grim. They send you the galleys. The galleys are the pages of your book which you're asked to read for errors. So you sit down one Saturday afternoon and begin to read, say, Paris Trout. And 20 minutes later it hits you that it doesn't make any sense at all. You recognize the words, you just don't know what they got to do with each other. And you get up and you think, I'm having a bad day, and you maybe, the house gets painted. And you sit back down a week later and you try it again, and it's the same thing. And you call Bob in New York and tell him you think, we're both in trouble. My guy, by the way, is named Bob Loomis, and he's, anyway, I'll get to that later. Bob says not to worry. He always says not to worry. He's seen writers react the same way. He's seen me react the same way. He says, you're too close to it. Now, Bob Loomis is a senior vice president at Random House. I think he's about second down from the top. The guy's been there a long time, and he's got a lot of writers like, he's got Sheehan and, Steyer, and dozens of other famous, really famous writers. And so this is all to say he's been around the track a few times. And as comforting as it may be to know that somebody respectable, once had the same problem you got, it can also be real annoying to hear that from Bob. For instance, it was a fairly well-publicized thing after the book awards. The story came out, which that I'd lost 110 pages right out of the middle of the manuscript of Paris Trout on a computer. I wrote this book on a computer instead of a typewriter the way you're supposed to. And it just vanished. I got a little message up at the top that said something about you have an error in your hard disk and correct it. It said correct and restart or something. And I did, and I called the computer place, and it just went black for a minute, and then when it came back, 110 pages of Paris Trout appeared as a line of those golden little smiley faces, one line of them right across the middle of this dark screen. And I never got it back. And when I called Bob at Random House that afternoon to tell him what had happened, his immediate reaction was to remind me that Thomas Carlyle had lost his entire manuscript of the French Revolution in a house fire and had to rewrite the whole thing. And I said, tell me something, Bob. I said, if this were Esther calling, Esther's my agent. If this were Esther calling to tell you that I'd just been run over by a truck, would you tell her that was interesting that Thomas Carlyle's dead too? He said, don't get huffy. You can do it again. Anyway, the manuscript doesn't make sense. Bob tells you not to worry. He says you're too close to the book. So I try to put some distance between myself and this book, but it's a very difficult thing. At the same time, they're expecting you to read the galleys for errors. And so what you end up doing is just reading the words and ignoring what they mean. At that point, you're taking it on faith that you do know how to write, or that at least you did know how to write when this was going on. And when you run out of words on the last page of the galleys, you send them back. And then there's another 3 months when nothing happens. Maybe you start a new book, you do start reading the New York Times book review, I can tell you that. You do things that maybe pick up some magazine work or something. And I just tell you, while I was waiting for my first novel, God's Pocket, to come out, I had enough time to finish teaching my dog Harry to sneeze when I told him to. And teaching your dog to sneeze when you tell him to, by the way, is... If I could just stray a moment here from the subject... That represents almost exactly the same amount of time and commitment as it does to write A Bright Shining Lie. And the difference is that a book like A Bright Shining Lie, that book's going to be around forever. And a month after I taught the dog to sneeze, he went deaf and he couldn't hear me say it anymore. And often... curiously enough, that's the way you end up looking at your own book. People say nice things about it for a couple of weeks and then it's gone. And it doesn't, not enough people buy it to cause a stir. It's your own deaf dog, the trick is in there, but you can't get at it anymore. But I'm getting ahead of myself. But before you realize your book is deaf, there's still a couple of things you have to go through. You look at the cover in a lot of different forms. They call you and say, do you like this? And you can't tell. If you say, no, I really hate this, they'll say, yeah, it's awful. And you say, this is pretty good, Bob. He'll say, yeah, we like it too, and it's got nothing. Anyway, in the end, it's as confused as the book itself. And then you collect quotes. The one, you heard Jim, read Pete Dexter's, reminds me of Flannery O'Connor or whatever Styron said, and then something Blunt said. It. You don't collect those yourself. Your publisher does it. But the whole process feels an awful lot like begging. It's when he mentions, he sent this thing to Styron, you say, oh, geez, Bob, don't do that. Just on the other end of it, I can tell you that once you become a little better known, you do just start getting, I've had weeks when I've had 12 or 15 manuscripts sent to me unsolicited by people I don't know, agent. I'm not talking about the writers, but also the editors. And it was just, it's, you know, when you get a few minutes, can you read this 600 pages and write a blurb that this is better than Paris Trout, you know? And I. So anyway, you collect the quotes, you watch the quotes get collected, you find yourself walking into bookstores as publication date comes and wondering, you know, what they're going to do with it and where it's going to be. And it seems like a long time before it actually shows up. It's always a week or two later than they say it's going to be. And then it is in the bookstores, but it's also in the reviews. And yeah, I'm going to have a few things to say about reviews here. Let me start by saying, first of all the things I've talked about that aren't fun about writing a book, they're all more fun, including the leg operation, than the reviews. I see reviewers falling into two large categories. Actually, I see them falling into tar pits, you know, but I don't want to be petty here. Am I complaining too much? You know, I talk about the joy of doing this, and if something comes to me. Anyway, the first kind of reviewers and the most dangerous kind of reviewers are the ones on the make, who are going to use your book to make themselves look smart. If possible, going to make use your book to make themselves look at least smarter than you are. And this particular kind of reviewer is everywhere, and they are breeding. You know, they just show up. It's hard to pick up something now that reviews many books where you don't see it, and it's well, I get into that. These people, this kind of reviewer, doesn't really care about the novel or the nonfiction book one way or the other. What they care about is the pose they strike as they review it. I mean, this pose is similar to the pose you're going to strike later on if they do write a book themselves and they're sitting in the bars telling people, you know, that there are exceptions to the rule because they've actually written a novel. And these people, believe me, pull no beautiful weeds because they don't fit. I mean, they make astounding pronouncements, you know, both good and bad, you know, without a hint of credentials. But then, you know, when these pronouncements find their way into, say, the Sunday New York Times, which, you know, it's got a problem because it's got any given week, I suppose they must review 25 or 30 books, and they can't, you know, those things are mostly going to freelancers, and most people don't want to review books. So anyway, when they show up in the New York Times, the paper's credentials, you know, become the reviewer's credentials. And good books, I've seen a lot of good books, you know, cheapened and dismissed just at the whim, and it's not even so much of it's done at the whim of twerps. I mean, it's just these people that don't have the investment, you know, haven't paid the price. And it's no favor, really, at least to my mind, to have these guys like that, you know, get behind your book and like it, because they will invariably sacrifice, you know, what's best about the book for the sake of the essay that they believe they're writing. And in the end, it's all kind of, I don't know, it leaves you even good reviews leave you kind of, I'm looking for a word here. It's not cheated, but it really brings you up short. It's really an affront. And then there's the other kind of reviewers, which are also dangerous, and they're the politicians. And the example that comes to mind here, you know, very clearly is a regular reviewer of the New York, you know, the Daily New York Times, which is a separate department from the Sunday Times. And this person, along with the rest of the Times, had in 1987 ignored a novel called Paco's Story, which had the bad taste to then go on and win the National Book Award over a book called, you know, Beloved by Toni Morrison, which had been the favorite. Now, Toni Morrison, of course, is a beloved and respected writer for excellent reasons. And that's also, which is, you know, universally, which means that the New York Times is also going to love and respect her. Larry Heinemann, on the other hand, the guy who wrote Paco's story, was pretty much unknown, at least in New York circles. He's from Chicago, and the one other book he wrote didn't do much. And all that's to say, until, you know, Larry marries into Arthur Gelb's family, the Times isn't going to love him at all. His novel, however, was a deeply felt book, and it was an amazingly powerful piece of work. And when the judges of the National Book Award gave him the nod over Toni Morrison, the Times Daily Critic, and I can only guess, you know, the reason for this, but I guess it was an affront to the paper's preeminent position among, you know, in book criticism. Anyway, she finally addressed Paco's story in print, and as much as she could, she just tore it to pieces. And yeah, you look at that and you wonder, you know, for what? Yeah, I mean, even if Paco's story had been a bad book or a dishonest book, which it certainly wasn't, it's still easier to defend writing a bad book than it is writing that review, at least to me. I mean, you write a bad book, you write a bad book. That isn't as bad as, it isn't bad as sticking up a 7-Eleven even. It isn't nearly as bad as trashing somebody else's work to, you know, cover your own oversights as a critic. Now, it was during this same period of time, you might remember, that the Times ran a famous letter. I don't know if you know what we're talking about? There was a letter signed by 48 black writers and critics lobbying for a Pulitzer for Toni Morrison. And when she, in fact, won the Pulitzer, which was a done deal once the finalists were named, the Times, in a news story, allowed its Sunday book editor, a fellow named Herbert Mitgang, to write, and I wrote this down to get it right, "Literary figures agreed today that Beloved had won the Pulitzer Prize on its own much-deserved merits as a novel." Now that, I mean, without any attribution, I can tell you that violates not only all the rules I know about newspapers and writing news stories, it violates all the New York Times rules too. And the point here isn't that somebody at the Times liked Beloved better than they liked Paco's story, or even they endorsed Ms. Morrison's notion. Her idea was that she'd overcome this letter to win a Pulitzer, and the notion being that she'd carried high weight into the race and won anyway. But the point to look at here, I think, is the spectacle of the most powerful and influential newspaper in the world insisting on the authority of its own opinions, and that way protecting the status of those opinions, and at the same time it's willing to step on the single writer to do that. And all he ever did, I mean, his only offense was to write a wonderful book that the paper chose to ignore. And there are a dozen, I mean, this political thing can go a dozen different ways I can think of. I mean, nonfiction books are routinely assigned to writers writing a book on the same subject, you know, competing books. Certain critics are known, you know, ahead of time that they're killers, and certain critics are going to always send Valentines. You know, reviewers will come into a book with an unmovable view and refuse to look at what's on the page. You know, personal grudges get settled, just unbelievable bullshit. And because the places where the reviews have any impact at all are so few, and because selling a hardback book is so hard, I mean, it's a very difficult thing to do. I'm not talking about for the writer, I'm talking about for the publisher. I mean, I don't know the figures, but it's a very small percentage of books actually make any money. The only chance most books have, you know, quality books, unless they're by famous writers, lies in the hand of, you know, some anonymous book editor making an arbitrary assignment that day. It depends on what kind of mood he's in, whether he's going to give it to a killer or somebody with a Valentine. And all I'm saying about that is that it's disheartening. And all that isn't to say, by the way, there aren't good critics, or that some of them don't even show up in the Sunday Times. People with enough sense to look at a sentence and accept it in the context it's written, or don't impose their own, you know, prejudices or views or politics on another person's work. But it is to say there aren't very many of them. Now, at this point, you may still be wondering how all this makes book reviewers dangerous. And so let me just tell you one more story, if you don't mind, a story of personal danger and horror, really. My second novel, Deadwood, was reviewed favorably in Time magazine. I didn't think the review was long enough for, but it was there and it had a nice sound and they said good things about it. But somewhere in the second or third paragraph, the reviewer allowed himself the observation that while the book was a good story, I hadn't let the historical fact get in the way of, having a good time reading it. And as an example, he cited the fact, and I put that in quotes, that in Deadwood the book, Jack McCall, the man who assassinated Bill Hickok, was tried by a miners' court and released. In Deadwood the town, he said, McCall was tried by a miners' court and hanged. Now the facts, which are not hard at all to document in the case, I had it right. Jack McCall was tried and released and then rearrested in Wyoming. He was taken to Yankton in the Dakota Territory and tried again and subsequently hanged. And I know this because I'd taken 3 different trips to Deadwood to make sure my story didn't stumble over the facts. As far as I know, the book was faithful to, what can be documented about that place and that time. There's no airplanes in it. The rub, though, and here's where it gets dangerous, is I've been there 3 times, 2 and 3 weeks at a shot, and a year later, my wife is sitting across the breakfast table reading Time magazine, and suddenly she's glaring at me, and you heard about Wild Bill's, dangerous eyes, by the way. He doesn't have anything on her. And she says, "Where the hell were you anyway?" And you have to ask yourself at a time like that, at the end of this process, why do you put yourself in this position? This is not fun. And there has to be some reason for it. The reason that I'm a naturally unproductive underachiever. And there's got to be a reason that someone like that would get up every morning for 18 months and put 900 words on a piece of paper before he did anything else that day. And the answer, I guess, lies in the writing itself. Come back to that, and pulling things out and the naming them. In those moments when things are clear and you can say what they're like. And I know that doesn't sound like much coming from a person who once, threw an open container at Jimmy Mims and missed him and splashed it right in the middle of Miss Calhoun's hairdo. But everybody has to move on, and I guess you cannot do that forever. And I think that's probably, not that anybody asked me, advice or any lessons, but I would say that that's the hardest lesson a writer has to learn and to keep learning, is that you cannot rest on your laurels forever. You got to keep doing it. God damn, I almost got an hour out of this. Now, I'd be happy to entertain questions or happy to sit down. Yes. Yeah, she asked why I picked Paris Trout for the title. This book was based loosely on an event that happened in Milledgeville, Georgia in 1953 when I was, I guess a 9-year-old kid living there. I was in the middle of a celebration. There was a shootout. A guy was a crazy man, shot 2 of the most beloved people in that town and killed them. And as I wrote this book, I went back to Milledgeville and I used the actual names of the people as I went through just as a reference point and forgot about that until it was maybe, the second time that Bob would send me this stuff and I was going to drop it on his desk. And he said something like, "These are, fictitious names, aren't they?" And I had 24 hours to change everybody's name and all the town's names, everything in that book. And with Paris Trout, the way I did it, I said, "I'll take a fish in a city." That's true. It could have been Carp Rome. Listen, thank you for your patience. I appreciate it.